Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll hear a music video from Elisa Corinne about the Civilian Conservation Corps. But first, joining us now is North Dakota State University political science professor Nick Barath. Nick, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me today.
Obviously, not a lot going on in politics, but so we're here to talk about sort of the presidential election and North Dakota politics, what's going on. But before we do that, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, Nick Barath. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, before I got into the whole academic career, I did newspaper stuff in Seattle, went to college and graduate school in Chicago, and moved around a little bit, and I got here in Fargo in North Dakota State University in 2004. So I've been around, but I'm here for the long term now.
Yeah. So what got you interested in political science?
Well, when I was doing these neighborhood newspaper jobs in Seattle, I would watch the city council, the county commission, all these sort of local and state officials will be very boring sometimes, but they would come up with ideas and policies that would affect the neighborhoods I was covering. So I became fascinated with that and decided state and local politics and American politics would be my thing.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some of the political happenings that's been going on as we record this. So both national, as I said, and in North Dakota. But let's start with sort of who might succeed President Obama. Seems like the anti-politician phrase is upon us now, and Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders sort of fit that bill.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Oh my goodness, it's like at this point it's so hard to read the tea leaves, but it's certainly, if I was looking at the people who are running for office, it's definitely clear that the Republicans think that 2016 is their year. You have all these nationally known politicians, governors, senators, people who have really succeeded in their political careers, and they're making their once-in-a-lifetime shot for president. And so if you're looking at the people who are out for the Republicans, they think this is their year. Whether that's true or not, well, we'll see. But they certainly think that, you know, if they're going to be president, the moment's now. On the Democratic side, it seems as if there's a generational shift going on. I mean, Hillary Clinton is certainly there, and Bernie Sanders, and who knows, maybe Joe Biden. But you don't quite have as many people who are prominent national politicians competing as with the Republicans. I think that's a residue of the 2010 elections, where you had the Democratic Party had a real wipeout that year. A lot of people who were up-and-comers are no longer around. So if you're looking at it long-term, short-term, this is going to be a fascinating presidential election.
Well, and of course, we've already seen polls shift, I guess I could say. But so what do you think will happen in Iowa and New Hampshire? I mean, crystal ball's out there. Is it Trump and Sanders or what?
Well, they always tell you not to make predictions, but I can sort of say there are certain things to watch out for. If I was a Republican, you know, sort of the people, some of the more, I guess, mainstream Republicans, I would be looking at Ben Carson, I would be looking at Donald Trump, that their support would slowly deflate over time, that we're kind of in the beauty pageant stage of that. People are checking out their options, and who knows, even in Iowa and Vermont, they might do very well. But if I was, you know, a Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, I would sort of bide my time. I would sort of say, all right, let's not antagonize people who are supporting Trump and Carson, say you know, Trump's no good or something like that. Let's sort of bide my time, support Trump wherever I can on policy, and wait for that moment for them to deflate. And we're in a different era now, because if you're trying to survive as a national politician, the super PACs are really a godsend to you, that you don't necessarily have to have high poll numbers. You just have to have some very wealthy supporters with deep pockets who are willing to get involved, whether or not you're standing at 30% right now or 10%. So right now on the Republican side, I don't think it's as chaotic as people think. I think that if you're at least a competent national politician, it's time, don't panic. Just sort of wait things out. Again, it's hard to see Trump, still it's hard to see him as the nominee. And I think over time his support will deflate. He won't disappear. He's certainly an interesting figure for a lot of reasons. But if I was even a Jeb Bush, I would just wait and wait for things to turn around. On the Democratic side, well, there's always been a strong, or at least a strong anti-Clinton movement in the Democratic Party. Whether it's Bill Clinton or Hillary, there's always been probably at least a third of the people who are just dissatisfied with that. And so it was always kind of expected that Hillary Clinton's poll numbers couldn't stay in the as high as they could. What will be interesting is, well, if Bernie Sanders is the main opposition to her, whether he can build beyond that sort of 1/3 that are always going to be reluctant to support Hillary Clinton in the primaries. And luckily for Sanders, the Iowa caucus, the New Hampshire primary, are probably going to be his best shot at winning an important part of this nomination process. That's going to be the 2 states that are most willing to listen to an alternative approach, that they're wooable, I guess is the way to say it.
Yeah. Well, you sort of answered this, because I wanted to ask, can Trump actually be the nominee, or do you think the Republican machinery will sort of prevent this?
Well, as we know, it's not just national popularity polls that determine an elect or nomination process, that it really matters how you do in each individual state. And as we know in North Dakota, sometimes parties play around with those rules. They can sort of help out or hurt somebody who maybe don't know the rules quite well, aren't quite so in with the establishment, so to speak. So I think it's important to see the polls, but how good a ground game you got in Iowa really is going to be what matters. How well you can get people to support you at state party conventions is what's going to get you delegates and such. So one of the things that's going to be really important if Trump is truly going to translate into being a credible candidate is, can this sort of support and attention he's getting translate into some sort of ground game, some sort of political structure where you have people who are at the Iowa, New Hampshire, at the state level, putting their political careers at risk for Donald Trump or Ben Carson, or if they want to go with the tried and true and say Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz is the way to further my career.
Mm-hmm. Switching to Hillary a little bit, months ago, 6-8 months ago, Hillary might have been the heir apparent in some ways. I'm paraphrasing, but since then, obviously she's been damaged by different things that have come out in the email. Is she permanently damaged with that, or what?
Well, of course, that will remain to be seen. But ultimately, whoever gets the nomination, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, what they're going to have to do is make sure that their base comes out to support them in the general election. And this is kind of a major task of the conventions and so forth, that you have to get your base support out. And if you can do that, then emails don't matter. If you can do that, whether you're socialists or not, doesn't matter. Because for both parties, getting your base out, your base supporters out, you're getting close to getting a majority, or at least you're within distance of getting a majority in the Electoral College. So a lot of what's going on is important. It will sort of color how people will focus on Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders when the general election time comes along. But again, whether Democrats are permanently going to turn away from Hillary Clinton, I don't see that happening, because the alternative that they'll see on the Republican side is going to be quite a contrast. It's not going to be a Tweedledee, Tweedledum sort of election. There's going to be some real choices. And to say that I'm going to go and vote for Republicans because of these emails seems unlikely with the Democrats. Where it's going to come in with these emails, if it becomes a permanent thing, is that you can have people who are supporters, Democratic base, who just get bummed out, say, oh, we're not going to win, there's no way we can do this. And so if that 1 to 5% decide to just sit on their hands and stay home, then that's where it will come in at the end.
Mm-hmm. Are you surprised thus far with Jeb Bush, Scott Walker, how they underperformed on the campaign trail?
Yes, to an extent I am. Scott Walker in particular, because it seemed, but on the other side, I would say, Scott Walker, don't panic. Your support for Walker and Bush to a lesser extent has shifted over to Trump and Ben Carson to an extent, and it's done this fairly quickly, but it kind of makes you think, if you're in this for the long haul and don't panic, that this support can come back. That again, if these people who've dominated much of the discussion so far deflate for whatever reason, people take a closer look as they're actually casting votes, then you, as Scott Walker, can come back in. Now, where the problem comes out, though, of course, is that what's going on and what's coming to an end is the hidden primary, where consultants, where local politicians announce their support for a particular candidate. And if you're in Iowa right now and you're like, all right, I want to be with a winner or somebody who's competitive, you're going to say, well, Scott Walker looked like the man, but I'm reading these polls, they're not so good, so I'm going to go somewhere else. And so that's where probably the most important damage is going to be done if you're Scott Walker and want to become president.
Mm-hmm. And Ben Carson, John Kasich, you mentioned, they've gained momentum since the first debate. And can you comment on that?
Well, it'd be interesting to see with Ben Carson, because it almost seems like sometimes he's the anti-Trump. He tends to be a lot more low-key, tends to spend much more time talking about his life history, his life story, and that's been very attractive to people. And his politics, though, tend to be, if you're looking at the actual policies, tend to be a little bit more extreme than Trump. Trump has been accused of a lot of stuff, but he's sort of all over the map if you're thinking of ideology. Ben Carson isn't, so it's sort of like he's, you know, if you're a true believer and you want somebody who's sort of low-key, he seems to be, at least for the moment, a place to park a vote. Whether that translate into a ground game, whether he is somebody who can you know, withstand a number of people going for his throat, which hasn't happened so far, again, it remains to see. He's been untested. He's never run for office before, so it could turn out that once the pressure's on, he folds or does poorly.
Yeah. With that said, who are the other Republicans that you think might have a shot? I mean, and sort of with so many Republicans announced, who's that an advantage for?
Well, I think it's an advantage for someone like Ted Cruz, for one, because I think he's a fairly good politician. He's patient and such, and he's trying to nail down the sort of people who are supporting Trump, that he thinks that this could translate over to him. And as Carson and Trump have gotten a lot of attention, Cruz hasn't disappeared. He hasn't lost all his support, and he's in the Senate right now, this being, of course, September, sort of threatening to shut down the government over Planned Parenthood and such. So he's somebody who's in a very prominent position and not afraid to be something of a bomb thrower. The other person who's sort of right now skating, she's taking a pass on a lot of stuff, is Senator Rubio from Florida. And he's somebody who's going to be very attractive for the national ticket because of his relative youth. He seems to, you know, talk about the policy issues quite well. And he's in Florida, which is going to be likely one of the swing states that decides the whole thing. And so he may or may not be somebody they nominate to be president, but if you're a Republican nominee, he looks a lot of ways like the perfect nominee for at least vice president. And that's something that I think will happen with the sort of, you know, people call it cattle call right now with the Republican Party, that a lot of people who are running for office and will fall away, well, they'll be perfect candidates for a Republican cabinet. So it's not as if, you know, there's not good reason to stick this out if you're a Carly Fiorina or some such, who probably doesn't have a very good shot at winning the nomination, but certainly can become prominent, certainly get a base of supporter, and if the Republicans take the presidential election in 2016, would have a legitimate claim for some sort of cabinet position. So there's a lot of elements going on here and a lot of things to make a candidate stay in the race.
Okay. Is Bernie Sanders electable, or will the socialist tag sort of haunt him?
I think the socialist tag will haunt him, and I think right now at least the fact that his support is very strong amongst white liberals, it's pretty strong in New Hampshire and in Iowa, but when you get into the South and when you get amongst African American voters, they're still very strongly for Hillary Clinton. They see a past relationship with her and really liked Bill Clinton's presidency. And that's not something that's just going to be cast aside over emails. So if Bernie Sanders is going to actually be a legitimate candidate, somebody who can actually win the nomination in the presidential election, he's going to have to make a very strong and effective appeal for that vote. And that's not easily done. It's not, you know, that's something that so far he's been able to get sort of the anti-Clinton vote, sort of the more progressive liberal vote that's out there, and that's certainly an accomplishment. But he's really got to cross over to the other components of the Democratic coalition.
Oh, now, as we're sitting here recording this today, Joe Biden has not announced. A lot of discussion about that, but so we at least have to touch on it. If he announces and runs, do you think he has a good chance?
Well, I mean, he certainly is an alternative. The thing that I think would be a real problem is that by and large, he sat out this hidden primary period that he hasn't really put together, as far as I can tell, as far as the readings that I've done can tell, that he hasn't really put together a campaign organization in the early states, in the South, and other places. He certainly got the name recognition. There's certainly a lot of people who like Joe Biden, but he doesn't have that structure together. And if you're going to be a legitimate contender, you really do have to be built for the long term. A quick win in Iowa and New Hampshire is certainly great, but isn't going to be enough, isn't going to be enough to carry you through. And again, a lot of the voters, well, Joe Biden's been in Democratic politics for a long time. He had a really good shot at winning the nomination back way in 1988. And so switching from Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden doesn't seem like a radical change. I mean, again, who knows what's going to happen with this email scandal? Who knows how things will lay out with Joe Biden? But it's not as if he's sort of the knight in white on a white horse that people have been waiting for to save the Democratic Party. But we'll see. If he does come in, it does create a problem for Clinton because it could break that support, split it a little bit. And it could also create an opportunity for Bernie Sanders if he's going to be the long-term answer.
Mm-hmm. All right, so in a general election, what party do you think has the edge? I mean, some say that the electoral map and the demographics still favor the Democrats.
Right. And looking at it from the last couple of elections, that does seem to be the trend. But the issue is, you know, that the election's close. I mean, with the Electoral College. The Electoral College is the one that decides it all. And so, you know, this is going to be aggravating to hear, but it's probably going to come down again to what happens in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, and a couple of the swing states, which tend to lean, or last couple of elections tended to have leaned Democrat, but not by a whole lot. It's pretty narrow, and you could see if, you know, some few breaks go the other way, that they could swing to the Republicans. I think no matter who gets nominated from both parties, it's going to be a close election. It'll be another of those nail-biting sort of elections that won't be clear who's going to win coming into last week, is sort of what I expect. Again, many things could happen, and who knows what the candidates will do. But right now, yes, I would say demographically, it sort of leans towards the Democrats. But that Electoral College is a funny thing, and you could still easily have a Republican victory.
Okay. Oh, there's so much here to cover.
Yes.
But let's turn to North Dakota for just a few minutes here.
Okay.
Heidi Heitkamp has announced she will not run for governor.
Yeah.
Governor Dalrymple, of course, is out. And Lieutenant Governor Drew Wrigley, of course, has admitted to an extramarital affair. And so it's becoming sort of a topsy-turvy race, maybe. Can you tell us your thoughts and who the candidates might be?
Well, boy, I mean, on the Republican side, it's up in the air, because if you're the Republicans, if you're Drew Wrigley, you're the Attorney General, if you're some outsider, it seems a pretty clear path that you're going to win. I mean, again, provided you run a halfway effective election. Because the real story, of course, is that the Democrats' bench is really bare right now. That it seems like the events of 2010, when you had you started having a complete overturn of the congressional delegation, and the fact that they haven't really been able to compete very much beyond the Heidi Heitkamp at the statewide level for a long time, means that you have, well, sort of a generation shift, a lot of new people elected at the state legislature. But so far, at least, nobody who's come forward and made an appeal that would work across the state. So they're kind of, that's sort of the story right now, is the Democrats are either, well, if you're being kind to them, in a transition period, or sort of in a static, sort of stagnant state right this moment. And so I think that's the real issue. What's going to be interesting is that if they do poorly or some such in this next election, and you have, on the Republican side, new leadership coming in and perhaps maybe a little bit more aggressive with ideology, does this sort of raise the stakes? You know, if we have politics continue in the same sort of way that it has for a long time in North Dakota, it will continue. I don't see any grand movement to the Democrats. But what's always interesting is the events that have happened in Kansas, where Republicans took control, State House, State Senate, and the governorship, all the offices across the state. And the governor, I believe it's Brownback, had decided that he was going to use Kansas as sort of a site for an experiment, and was going to really push a lot of conservative things to as far as he could. If you get somebody and does something like that in North Dakota, that would be a part where I'd start seeing that the Democratic Party would start coming back to life, that the still called moderate Republicans would look for a new home. So something like that is what I'm watching for. Otherwise, at least for the short term, it's probably going to be a tough election cycle for Democrats in North Dakota. Okay.
Is Senator Hoeven going to be hard to beat in 2016 as he seeks re-election, assuming he does?
Yes. Well, assuming he does, and well, he hasn't said anything otherwise, and there's nobody who's been stepping forward as an alternative. He looks pretty good. I mean, he won election the first time around with, I don't know, what, 70% or so of the vote, and he had somebody who was relatively known as a Democrat. And this time there's no obvious opposition, and he's an incumbent, and there's no reason to complain about him. He hasn't done anything horrible. And the state economy, although the oil stuff is a little bit picky these days, looks pretty good, and he's in opposition to the Democrats. It's hard to see him losing that election. Again, unless something unexpected happens.
As you teach classes at North Dakota State University, political science, what kind of careers do people have?
Well, that always gets to be the interesting question. A lot of people who come to NDSU who go to take a political science major are interested in law school. So they do our pre-law stuff and they go on to law school. Some of people are interested in going on to graduate school, you know, becoming maybe a professor or becoming maybe in public administration.
Nick, there were a lot more questions we wish we could have asked, but if people want to get information, good objective information, where should they go?
Oh my goodness. Well, the thing is there's a lot of good, you know, ideologically there's a lot of good stuff. I always start out with the basics of the New York Times, Washington Post, just to get that basic information. But beyond that, there's a lot of good conservative and liberal and in-between websites out there to check out. So, you know, go with what you like.
Nick, thanks for joining us. It's going to be an interesting campaign trail.
It's fun stuff. Thank you.
Stay tuned for more. In 1933, President Roosevelt proposed an ambitious program to Congress that soon came to be known as the Civilian Conservation Corps. Minnesota's economy and infrastructure greatly benefited from the program, as did thousands of enlisted young men. Elisa Corinne will use music to tell the story of the CCC.
Civilian Conservation Corps is forgotten now. It's only lore, but our works remain to remind you when 3.5 million men joined Roosevelt's Tree Army, built country and economy, and out of the Great Depression marched a wave of human progression. Put the shovels in our hands, we can take it. Send local boys across the lands, we can take it. Give us swamps and forests to reclaim, we can take it. Give us America's wilds to tame. We weren't even 20, some came in at 16. Didn't need money or degree, just an interview for the CCC. They asked, are you robust? Are you crabby, optimistic, and happy? 1 out of every 5 got to stay to earn for their families $1 a day. Take off your clothes, boys, show you're tough. Medical exam in the buff. 2 pairs of shoes, 2 trousers, 2 shirts, underwear, and a cap for work. Nothing fit, 2 sizes too big, but you didn't complain. Not worth it to quit. Build our bunks, then build the camp, we can take it. Wield a shovel, then an axe, we can take it. Cut ski trails even if we can't ski, we can take it. Hide behind a bush when there's no latrine. Bugle call before lights out. Reveille, 600 hours. Trumpet blows you out of the sack. 200 men in a mad dash. Latrine and wash, shower and shave. Single file to breakfast. Eat what you take. Enough food to gain 10 pounds at least. Never at home have I had such a feast. Daybreak in the barracks, truck to the field. 8 hours of labor, return piecemeal. After dinner, after work, take a class, play a sport, learn to read, learn a new skill, hard work and goodwill. Cut new trails and fire breaks, we can take it. Fight forest fires with whatever it takes, we can take it. Build dams, bridges and miles of road, we can take it. Earn $5, send 25 home. We didn't live in palaces at the College of Colossal Calluses. 3.5 million men reclaimed the plains and groomed the land. Roosevelt's Tree Army did more than plant 3 billion trees. We restocked 1 billion fish to streams, controlled mosquitoes and disease, drained 250,000 acres of swamp, cut 28,000 trails to Trump, built 100,000 miles of road, strung just as much line for the telephone, campgrounds, buildings, 800 state parks, carry the CCC trademark.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse for this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funding for Minnesota Legacy programs are provided by a grant from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, and by the members of Prairie Public.